Hello, I'm Marguerite Benu-Hammerth, using she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Office of Inclusive Excellence. Thank you for joining us today at our Create Sea Change Forum featuring our guest, Professor Carrie Ann O'Meara from the University of Maryland. I'd first like to share a land acknowledgement. Stating that our Office of Inclusive Excellence at UCI acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded land of the Gabrielinos and Waneno-Achama Nation. As a land-grant university, it is vital to acknowledge and make visible UCI's relationship to Native peoples, to recognize the history of the land on which we stand, and to affirm the past, present, and future of the Gabrielinos and Waneno-Achama Nation here in this place. The acknowledgement is a living narrative and serves as a call to action for all members of the UCI community. Today's session is made possible through the support of our campus and the University of California Office of the President, particularly through an Advancing Faculty Diversity grant received by UCI and titled Comparing Relevant Equity Advisor Tools to Empower. So that's the create part of the event title. And the event also highlights our ongoing work as part of UCI STEM Equity Achievement Change, or Sea Change Initiative. And that's the second part of our title for today's program. So now with all those acronyms covered, let me welcome you warmly to an engaging discussion. We seldom take the time, I think, to really be able to reflect together as a community. So to me, this is really valuable to have both in person as well as our virtual participants here. And so on behalf of Vice Chancellor, Interim Vice Chancellor Rodrigo Lazo and our team from the Office of Inclusive Excellence, we welcome you to the campus. This Create Sea Change Forum is part of a series of activities that were launched through our 5-year action plan as part of UCI Sea Change. Our 5 goals to deepen the use of best practices in faculty recruitment and retention, to broaden pathways to the professoriate, enhance impactful mentoring, and identify relevant metrics to chart our progress, align closely with the tenets of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Sea Change program. So that's the parent program we align to. We are really proud at UCI to be charter members of the AAAS Sea Change program, as well as Bronze Award recipient. As prestigious as these associations are and these designations, we're also cognizant of the real value of using a sea change framework to disrupt barriers and promote effective practices for talent development, and to know that that's really going to be borne out by the actions we take, right? And as well as the collaborations across UCI and our UC system, because not one of us can do this work alone. So what we do and how we show changes to enhance equity and inclusion should be the marker and the standard bearer for us. It is a stellar achievement that UC President Michael Drake has supported all of the UC campuses in their Sea Change work. We're really grateful at UCI. Our funded proposal is reflected in today's CREATE program. We envision CREATE as a way to really review, distill, and apply learning from equity leaders across the entire UC system. So bringing in all the wisdom in the room. Today's forum represents a deeper dive into conversations started last April through a symposium with system-wide participants about advancing systemic change. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this hybrid event, recognizing in advance that we strive to connect all of our participants. So both in person and virtually, we really hope this is going to be a very engaging experience. After some presentation dialogue with our speaker, we'll take questions and then all engage in a brief activity. For those who are virtual, we're going to have you in virtual breakout rooms. I humbly ask for your patience in advance if we hit any technology bumps along the way. I bring to your attention the past link that was shared with all participants in our OneDrive that connects you to not only today's program event flyer, but also readings and other information like connectivity here at the Student Center and beyond. The PowerPoint PDF from our speaker, she's graciously shared that, and that's uploaded for you as well. And we ask you not to publicly post or root the PDF that's shared with you. So our topic today focuses on taking strategic action for equity work. And our presenter, Carrie Ann O'Mara, joins us to discuss advancing equity in discretionary spaces, lessons learned, and strategies for action. Carrie Ann O'Mara is Professor of Higher Education and a Distinguished Scholar teacher at the University of Maryland. She draws on insights from organizational behavior, higher education research, and behavioral economics to identify and test policies, practices, and interventions to recruit and retain a diverse faculty. She served as director of the University of Maryland's Advanced Program for 10 years, leading evidence-based interventions in inclusive hiring, third space networks, and workload reform and faculty evaluation. She is widely published, served as president of her disciplinary association, mine as well, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and her research has been continuously funded by NSF since 2010, which is no small accomplishment. Professor O'Mara is currently leading a new NSF-funded study to understand the value and the evaluation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in faculty evaluation. She is a 2021-22 American Council on Education, or ACE, Fellow, and was hosted by Professor Kim Shadesell of Townsend University. She currently serves as assistant to the provost for strategic initiatives, where she's leading campus implementation of the Fearlessly Forward strategic plan. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Ann O'Mara.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Marguerite and I want to thank UC Irvine and the Sea Change program for inviting me to be with you. I really enjoy strategizing together with folks who are thinking about advancing equity in higher education. It's such important work, and I like stepping back from it, which is, I think, what we're trying to do here, and thinking about what we're trying to do in these spaces, how we're doing it, and the ways in which we can understand those outcomes. So I really appreciate the opportunity to visit this beautiful campus, as well as to be with those of you who are joining virtually. Originally, I was going to come down and stand there and on the floor, and I was going to do that, and then I realized this is actually the most central place in the room. So I'm going to sort of advance from here. So I want us to think about 3 explorations that I'm putting forward today. The first one is that much diversity, equity, and inclusion work occurs in discretionary spaces. These are places where there's opportunities to leverage, check, or restructure discretion to advance equity. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and why that framing might be useful. I want to pull in then 2 particular spaces that are of interest to both Sea Change and folks on, I think, each of the UC campuses doing this work, and that is faculty evaluation and workload reform. And then I want us to think a little bit about the resistance we get when we start to initiate various kinds of DEI-related and equity-focused initiatives, and how perhaps what we're trying to do by leveraging, checking, or restructuring discretion is implicated in that, but could also be used in how we respond. So this was the topic of my ASH presidential talk, and there's a longer talk that I can point you to where it's got lots of citations, and I pull on some of the folks that use these terms. And then there was an op-ed and some other things. If anybody's interested, I can send those to Marguerite. But basically, I defined, as did Michael Lipsky, a political scientist who used this term, and Deborah Ball, Dean Emeritus at the University of Michigan School of Education. Discretion, or the freedom to make decisions within a set of boundaries, within a set of parameters, right, is a defining characteristic of most professions, including the academic profession, and we might say higher education more generally. So just think about the fact that when we have someone, a judge, have multiple asylum cases come before, and they have to look at largely the same information, but also they have to look at nuances, right, to make really important decisions. Or we have a teacher interacting folks in a math classroom, trying to figure out how to receive answers and lift up individual students so that they feel as if they're heard and their ideas have merit, right? So they feel like they belong and are good at math. Or we think about a nurse in an ER trying to take in the new patients that come and figure out who's going to be seen next and how and why. So these are all professional settings. Michael Lipsky might have called this group street-level bureaucrats. And by that, he meant folks right in the front seat of where decision-making is going to happen, who make tons of small decisions that will have a significant impact on the stakeholders within, right? And will make many of those decisions outside the parameters of formal rules that they have to, or within the boundaries that have been set about formal rules. So the assumption made for professionals that are using discretion in these spaces is that discretion's being offered. Like, why does somebody have discretion in the ER or in the asylum case? Right? There's an idea that that person is bringing something to the table, that there's some professional expertise or judgment or knowledge that is necessary in that space, and that's why they have discretion. That there's some flexibility that's needed. The ER nurse clearly has to figure out, which prevailing condition is going to get worse fastest and needs to be seen, and a whole bunch of other factors, and often in real time. And there's this assumption that that discretion will be used not for private gain, but in some way for the public good. That's the sort of vocational assumption that people make about professions. And so, again, with this idea of discretion inside a donut, right? Rules are set by the hospital, for legal reasons, within the law, from the judge acting, that act as boundaries. Certainly as a faculty member in a classroom, there's decisions I can make and there's decisions that are out of my control. And that would be true of most areas of discretion. So discretion is really this idea of, okay, let's look at the field we're working in. Where are the boundaries that have been set that I can act within? And of course, that means we're going to have different amounts of discretion depending on what the context is. And I think we've seen over the last 3 years a lot of rewriting of these boundaries, right? Either because of urgency, because the discretion was not being used in agentic ways that advanced equity or harming equity, for reasons technologically in terms of what was happening with how we were doing our work. We've seen a lot of rewriting. But if we think about amounts of discretion, so somebody might be, a contingent faculty member might be told, you will not create your own syllabus for this class. You will use that standard syllabus. That's very little to no discretion at all. A search committee might be given a rubric that was designed with good intention, right? And asked to use this as a guidepost. It doesn't mean they won't read the applications and bring interpretation to it, but that it'll be a guidepost. That's a kind of medium level, perhaps, of checked discretion. And then there's significant discretion in what often seems like a very non-transparent place, such as voting in tenure and promotion decisions, right? Sort of an open discussion, a much more open sort of qualitative viewing of a situation and discussion. The idea, again, in the ideal, is that, again, that ER nurse, that judge, that faculty member making an admission decision needs that discretion because a standardized approach won't allow the awareness of context, the awareness of constraints or opportunities, the nuance that is actually really critical to making a good decision. So standardized approaches will not help or not work in those situations where discretion is granted. And yet, when granted discretion, we, especially in human service organizations, right, in organizations we're all a part of, we bring our own biases to that process, right? So we can act with discretion in ways that harm equity, as well as act as institutional agents to see equity gaps and move forward in those spaces. And I think it's important to think about how much discretionary space we have in higher education. So, if you are in a pretty hierarchical law firm, right, or you are in a situation with a lot of hierarchy and very defined closed roles, then there aren't as many discretionary spaces. The boss says to do this, and you do that. We have shared governance. We have microcultures of autonomy in various kinds of areas. We have a lot of discretionary space in higher education. So ideally, we would be leveraging individuals who would be the ones who would most know the context, the nuances, the holes. If this was like a nooks and crannies of some kind of a piece of bread, they would be able to see into those spaces and understand this interaction of, as the nurse in the ER, what is the age of this person coming in? And what am I seeing that's making me know they have to speed up, whereas this person could go after, even though they came in at different areas, right? So that would happen in all of these spaces: admissions, faculty evaluation. And so I think a lot of the work we're doing in DEI spaces is trying to leverage individuals to see equity gaps and act accordingly to advance equity in the various spaces that they encounter. So I want to pause here for a minute, and I'd like you to, in this room, I think we could do it at tables, and then online, I'd just like you to think about it for a moment, and you could just put it into the chat. I'd like you to think about a discretionary space where you're working. So this wouldn't be all the things you're trying to do. Pick one. So it could be you're working with a department on admission standards, or it could be you're looking at issues of workload for minoritized faculty. It might be related to new gen ed requirements related to diversity. It could be any of those spaces where there is significant discretion among the individuals that kind of own, shape, make that space move forward. I'd like you to think about the contours. So what are the limits of discretion there? And what are the areas for movement? And I'd like you to share that with somebody at your table. If you're at a table, you could turn to one person, or you could have a table-wide discussion of those. And again, I'd like folks to think about it for just about 30 seconds, to pick an area that you can focus on, and then add that to the chat if you'd like. All right, I think we'll come back together again. Can I get anybody to raise their hand and share an example of just a phrase of an area that you discussed that you're working in that might be considered a discretionary space? And I'll repeat your answer so that everybody can hear it in case it's not heard easily. We also have a microphone. That'd be even better. Fantastic. Can I get a volunteer? Oh, please, over here. Thank you.
We talked about graduate student admissions.
Excellent. Graduate student admissions is a great example. Certainly the work of Dr. Julie Posselt in graduate admissions and holistic evaluation of graduate students is a model there. It's absolutely about leveraging discretion, right? Trying to see especially somebody's achievements relevant to the opportunities that they've had. So that's a great example. Please, over here. Thank you.
So looking at overall compensations and not just salary.
Excellent. Lots of judgment goes into this, right? I remember being director of advance maybe 3 years in and running a seminar, and a faculty member came up to me and said, we are aware of a situation where two folks were hired the same year, and in one case, an identical position, same department, the salaries were pretty comparable, but one asked for a very different startup package because of mentoring, and one did not. And then you saw very stark differences. And it's interesting to see how in the world of DEI, both higher ed and non-higher ed organizations have dealt with that discretionary space of negotiation. So for example, at one point, the University of Michigan Stride program, I believe, had, maybe they still do, coaches for people who are negotiating their first positions. so that you could create a level playing field. And then you'll have organizations, this has been true in the public sector, kind of take on the approach of a car or an IKEA, there is no negotiation, like this is the salary in a very transparent way, so that, so that's another, that's kind of an elimination of discrimination as a way to solve that problem, or a leveraging of awareness to level the playing field of all the folks about to go into the negotiation. So that's another great example. Please.
So virtually, I don't know if either Sharon Block or Vic Ferreira want to say anything further, but they have shared in the virtual chat about graduate admissions and the flexibility to grant informal accommodations to our students in the face of requirements and deadlines.
That's absolutely. And we were talking about holistic admissions before, but there are so many spaces in the process of graduate admissions that are relevant. To what degree do faculty respond to emails from graduate students? To what degree can all students afford to come and interview on your campus or come there? And to what degree are some students offered research assistantships and others various kinds of funding in different ways? And does anybody have their kind of view of equity in those spaces? So those are great examples. All right, I'm going to move on, but I'm really happy because right now we have totally centered 3 examples that are perfect for this, this metaphor. So I've started to think about this as what we're trying to do with discretion, which is just so incredibly common in higher education and the way our organizations work, is we're either trying to leverage it, meaning help people see equity gaps and address them. We're trying to check it, which these are, by the way, not mutually exclusive. They overlap, and sometimes one doesn't work, and we try another, right? And we could be trying to do 2 simultaneously. But sometimes it's less about increased awareness and more about saying, okay, even well-informed folks are going to come to the table and make mistakes. They're going to veer off. So we're going to create guardrails. We're going to create parameters to operate within that will allow us to accomplish our goals. And sometimes we say, you know what, we have to eliminate discrimination. Excuse me. We have to eliminate discretion and discrimination. We have to eliminate the discretion that is too wide in this particular space, because after much attempts at trying to leverage through awareness and the creation of guardrails, we went off track. And it's not, and the urgency of now is here, and we need to restructure the discretion that folks have in that space. New parameters are needed. So I want to talk first about leveraging, and this is perhaps the area where some of a lot of work happens, is especially working with faculty to try to think about ways in which we can increase people's awareness of implicit biases, but also structural and systemic racism and kinds of barriers that exist, defaults that have been embedded in our systems that are preventing access, preventing success across different groups. That leveraging, right, is really trying to get folks to see kind of like this example that is often used in equity circles about, are you really able to create a way for folks to see things that they could not see before, including people's different access to, in this case, into the ball game, but are you able to create ways that faculty or academic leaders can see solutions, see problems and see solutions, and then themselves take ownership to address them? So just some examples of kinds of things that are often tools used in the area of leveraging discretion. Examining data together, right? Really common. So USC's Center for Urban Education Equity Scorecard is a common example of this, where a team of faculty, institutional researchers, academics, diversity officers, equity administrators might get together and look at a problem, look at data, and develop solutions from it. You're leveraging those different perspectives around the table. You're leveraging the data to create awareness that didn't exist before. Similar to that, the University of Michigan STRIDE program, which of course was one of the first advanced programs, has been so successful. Another are audits, right? So I created audits with my colleagues on faculty evaluation reform and workload reform. And these are to get people applying a set of questions and ideas to their own policies to see equity gaps. Pulling context into view, as we just discussed, is critical to both undergraduate and graduate admissions, as have COVID impact statements been an example of leveraging people's awareness of a situation, pulling context into to make it a fair evaluation. And then we see things like informational nudges, right? This is where there was a study, for example, that showed that right before a student takes a student evaluation, if they are reminded to focus on the content and very particular aspects of the course and their learning support, as opposed to ask more ambiguous questions such as, was this professor helpful, that enlist gendered kinds of, and many other kinds of stereotypes, that it actually can make it a positive effect on how those evaluations are completed. Likewise, Cal State, of course, there's a study of, the data success analytic kind of dashboards have been used in a number of situations to help faculty see, for example, that where are the courses in their major where students are most withdrawing or failing, and are there differences by race in those areas? If you look at your graduate admissions over the last 10 years, what are some patterns you see in both who applied, but also who came and why? So if we move on to checking discretion, this is also common in our work, right? So one of the common things you see is to apply a script, to say, so certainly when we think about classrooms and she, her, in my case, pronouns, and encouraging students on the first day to share the pronouns that describe them, those scripting that process, but also external letter reviewers to say specifically what we are expecting the external reviewer to say and not, that we're not interested in their view on, right? Those kinds of scripts are examples. Rubrics that we're using in hiring, sign off by the committee that you've taken a certain number of steps. I really like the example of the progress that was made in surgeries by doctors who before would just sort of go through a list, but not kind of informally, and there was no rule about it. And then they actually found when they went through the nurses, all of the various medical professionals with the doctor went through the 10 steps or whatever it was, reduced infection, reduced complications afterwards. So that's an example of creating like a guidepost, but also adding judgment to a decision. So saying, okay, we're not eliminating discretion. We're not just trying to leverage it by making people more aware. We're going to add judgment to the decision, right? So if you add an equity champion, as Daryl Smith and Ramon Lira have written about into searches, if you make sure there are multiple views on an admissions file, if you are careful about the composition of an evaluation committee. We also might think about policy reform, faculty evaluation reform, other kinds of policy reform, where we had ambiguity. We had to kind of make sense of what that means on your own. Say, for example, it says that to be a full professor, you have to have shown leadership in your field, but it's left very vague. Often strategically ambiguous, and there is a role for that, and in why people have done that. But nonetheless, if you know that it's causing an ambiguity that does harm because, let's say, community engagement in the field or some kind of interdisciplinary work is not counting when it's left that vague, adding very particular examples, a range of examples that would count to a policy is another way of checking or guiding discretion. And then we turn to restructuring discretion. So some examples of this are the work that's been done. You can look at the experiments by Yale and James Madison. They both did articles, and I think in biochemistry, where they talked about how they did a search that completely stripped identity. This is, of course, the model in some interviews for computer science jobs in Google or other places where they anonymize the voice. And it'll, of course, end at a certain point as you get closer to the hire, right? But there have been some positive outcomes from that kind of work. Certainly an equity administrator having the authority to turn back a search is a way of saying, you had discretion to make this choice, but at some point when you have not done what is our values, your discretion ends, and the discretion to make sure that we're following our values and our policies begins. Certainly target of opportunity hires, various requirements and accreditation. There's been some work recently. It's very likely the federal government will, in various agencies, continue to push for open science kinds of access for researchers to their data, right? And that those regulations will begin to continue to move forward. And to the degree that that happens, that's putting anybody who's funded is going to have to follow those regulations. In some ways, that's removing the discretion to say, I want to do research that's funded by the government and not share my data, right? It's a restructuring of discretion because that opportunity won't be available. Removing a barrier. So this is where we have, for example, a class that is consistently derailing somebody's opportunity to become an engineer. And nothing's been done about it, and folks don't want to change that class. Or as was the example in a great article by Cherry and Marcus of Harvey Mudd and their work to reorganize the computer science program to be more inclusive in terms of gender and race, where they reordered courses that were advantaging folks who had kind of experience in a way early on. That kind of removing of a barrier is another way to think about this. Certainly requiring DEI criteria when they didn't exist before for hiring, as has been part of the UC system, is another example of that. So I want to turn to two examples, and I'm just kind of dropping into them. I've done a lot of work on faculty evaluations. It's actually something I've studied for the last 20 years, but I just want to share a couple thoughts about this in relationship to this idea of leveraging, checking, and restructuring discretion. And I'm going to share some examples that are present in two ACE reports and an audit that we recently created with colleagues, and also some TIA papers about adding flexibility to tracks and to faculty appointments that hopefully, if you're interested, you can go back and read. So one thing to think about with faculty evaluation is that there are moments of discretion at each of these stages, right? So pre-evaluation, think about the departments where the way someone decides to go up to full professor is that it's a norm that somebody more senior in that department will sort of tap them and say, I think you're ready. But then what if nobody does? Or what if the word on the street is that person needs to have this kind of NIH proposal, even though they've got all of these other major things, right? So there's lots of discretion that happens outside of policy. Then there's the discretion that happens in policy, and I already provided an example of that, where the actual language that's used is guiding people's decision making. And then there's what happens in the meeting. If anybody in this room has been in a difficult tenure discussion in a department, you know that everything can immediately go in the wrong direction by one line from an external evaluator. That's another example of a moment of discretion. One of the things that we found helpful is to try in helping faculty members think about reform at their department or college or as a task force as part of the university level, to center a set of principles that they can use to analyze their own guidelines to hopefully leverage their discretion to make change. So these are some that we put out in that report, and I'm just going to give you a couple examples of how that might work. So the first one is looking at definitions of scholarship and scholarly products. So we, for example, have a very, let's say, narrow definition of scholarship that only rewards H-index or certain kinds of journals, right? And likewise, that means that certain kinds of impact are the only ones somebody can present to be considered legitimate or to have crossed the bar. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that problem in faculty evaluation? Well, one way to handle it is, of course, we do workshops, right? We create manuals, or we create ways to leverage the promotion and tenure or the faculty evaluation committee's insight by they're the ones who are going to know where the tripwires are that are not rewarding a broader definition of scholarship or that are limiting individuals in terms of, let's say, narrow definitions, epistemic exclusion, as Professors Isis Settles and Professor Nicole Buchanan would say. Another thing is to actually change the policy language, to say overtly, actually, we will not only require something as narrow as H-index or whatever it is in this book by this kind of a press in, say, the arts and humanities. We will actually provide language that says that the individual scholar can present evidence of the impact in any of these kinds of areas that best meet the kind of scholarship that they're doing. So actually changing the policy language. That's checking discretion. Another example is, of course, external letter scripts. And I'm going to move quickly through this because I think this is probably pretty familiar to everyone, but Ohio State, for example, will overtly say evaluators should specifically be asked not to comment on whether the candidate should be promoted and tenured. They should be asked about that for Ohio State and not whether, say, this person would be tenured at the University of Maryland if the letter was coming from me. So that's a way of creating some pretty strong parameters in a field where the norm has been to do exactly that. So let's take workload. So we know there is much gendered and racialized labor, and in the report that you saw that I shared, there's lots of citations of this, and the work is pretty clear in terms of these themes. Our project worked with one group for a year and a half and another group for a year on trying to leverage department teams to look at their own guidelines, policies, and practices, and to say, where do you see the equity gaps? And we did a variety of things. We tried to increase awareness. We tried to help them check and leverage discretion in terms of policies and practices, all using this set of sort of principles or values or guidelines to apply to the way they do things, right? And we were able to find that made a difference. In fact, we've published this in PLOS ONE and Journal of Higher Ed, Gender and Society, where we found that the departments that worked to move through those principles and look at their own guidelines, that made work activity more transparent through data dashboards, that put in rotations of time-intensive roles and credit systems, were more likely to register satisfaction with retention than those that didn't. And so I'll just quickly note that one of the first things we did is help them think through analyzing workload data together, typically in aggregate, in low transparency kinds of ways to begin the conversation, and then moving toward more transparency as folks felt more comfortable doing that. We wrote an article about that, and specifically the role of transparency and leveraging folks' discretion about reducing inequitable workload demands on minoritized faculty and women faculty. The policies that they put in place might be thought of as particularly trying to structure and to check discretion, right? So for example, let's say that the time-intensive roles were only being taken when the offer went out, we really need somebody to do this, and some people are the only ones to raise their hand in that informal space. Well, not if you've actually wrote down the 6 most time-intensive roles. You've created a rotation that is not opt-in, but opt-out, right? Meaning it's very hard to, everybody's gonna take their turn in that kind of rotation. All right, so those are my 2 examples, and we could talk more about that in a minute. I wanted to also think a little bit about the fact, though, that when you engage in any of these discretionary spaces to try to leverage, to try to check or restructure discretion with folks, you are going to find some resistance, right? We all will find different kinds of resistance. And certainly when we worked on workload reform, the teams that we worked with, for example, experienced that kind of resistance. So I want to talk a little bit about that in ending here. So the first thing to think about is how much we can learn from really leaning in and listening to the different kinds of resistance and what they could tell us about how to redesign the thing we're trying to do to be more likely to last and to have a bigger impact. It also can help you develop and identify allies of people who would like to be on the right side, but just feel uncomfortable with this thing that we're doing, right? They have fears about it. To try to bring them in and use that to garner buy-in. So these are by no means the only kinds of resistances that we experience when we're doing this work, but I think that these are a good place to start. You know, there's denial, there's not a problem, there's fear. If this happens, I'm gonna lose something, or this bad thing will happen. I don't know how to do this. I'm not sure we can even do it well. Lack of agency or skills. A sort of cynicism or a different definition of the problem. Well, you want to change the criteria, but I think the problem is really much earlier and out of our control, right? A competing commitment, as Keegan and Leahy like to talk about. I believe this diversity thing is important, but I have this other commitment to this other thing. Maybe usually it's posed against quality as if those are necessarily at odds. Or academic norms. In our field, we just don't do it this way, right? So some examples of strategies. So the first one, of course, is to think through what happens when you say there aren't any problems. You're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. So one of the things we can do is say, all right, well, you could be right. Let's look at some data together. And if you're right, data can reveal things that are not there as well as they are. And in our workload problem, we actually found that there were folks who thought, and likewise, when we first created salary dashboards, which we did at Maryland before we did our faculty workload project, there were times when people thought there were salary inequities or thought that there were workload inequities when you actually looked at the data, they were not there, right? That's what data does. It reveals all things. So let's just look at some data and see. When we look at data, if folks their biggest resistance is that it's going to, cause some embarrassment or other kinds of things, then we can work on transparency at levels and get people comfortable with it. We could also say, okay, maybe we don't have a problem, but we could. We're going to have a lot of turnover in our faculty. We've got changing context. This will just be a guardrail to make sure this bad thing doesn't happen in the future. What about strategies when people are afraid of something and they're going to lose something? Now, often people approach some of these changes as a zero-sum game. If this is elevated, this will lose, right? But not always is that necessary. Sometimes everybody can win, and sometimes some resource, some legitimacy, or some power is actually shifting. So we have to acknowledge both of those kinds of things. I've already mentioned this idea in working with workload issues. We used aggregate presentations of data to get people comfortable as a way of reducing the fear of embarrassment, so that people could see their own work in light of everybody else's without, say, particular names. There's a lot of ways that we can work with those fears, but if we understand them, we have a better chance of building them into our area. So clearly the way we work with the lack of agency and skill kind of resistance is to provide people tools. So that's why the work that Julie Pasalt and Mike Bastido and others have done at admissions was to train folks, right? Help them see ways in which rubrics or decision support tools could unearth, leverage a sense of opportunity, the opportunity that students had relevant to their achievements, right? And we see that across many areas of our work. There's also this sort of cynicism definition of the problem kind of issue. It's not going to make a difference. You're going to do this and you'll change your promotion tenure guidelines, you'll change this kind of thing, and some folks are going to continue doing what they were, and you will have done all this work for no reason. So one of the things that I think is really helpful there, and I've seen this with a number of reforms, is to focus on low-hanging fruit. You know, what is the small thing that can be changed, that people can get excited about, that it actually worked, and then you get to see some traction, and then you can develop allies for the next target of change. Also being leaders being very visible about those successes and creating incentives to the willing, right? These are all kind of antidotes in some ways, or responses to cynicism. And then there's this idea sort of our immunities to change that Keegan and Leahy talk about, or competing commitments. this is really about unearthing what they are. So one example of this is really, I think, kind of illustrative. There are postdoc conversion programs, right? So there's one in the UC system that's kind of like known very well around the country for what's been accomplished with it. But in let's say other institutions, I'm thinking of one in particular in the University System of Maryland, as they were creating it, they were talking to faculty, and their experience and their fear with it was that typically postdocs are sort of hired by one faculty member, right, who has a lot of authority over that hire. But that means that when it's time for the conversion later, the rest of the faculty have not gotten to weigh in on either the area of expertise, it's going to take up a line, this person seems like they're the mentee of one person as opposed to a new colleague that the entire department has brought in. So the redesign that folks who listened to that feedback did was to do a national search at the time that they brought in the postdoc and not have them assigned to one faculty member, but mentored by the entire department, so that everybody would be on board that as long as this went well, that person could convert into a tenure track position, not as the mentee of one person forever in that department, but as collectively brought in with the legitimacy of a national search, the legitimacy of everyone having chosen this person together. And that made for much more successful onboarding and transitions. I was thinking about Harry Potter with this picture. Then there's always some, especially with faculty evaluation reform, you will often find that a task force will want to take on something, and then a department or a college will say, that's really, really nice, you want to do that at the university level, but we can't do that because at the department level, we have this standard or we have that standard, and this just isn't gonna work. So what I think is really important here is, again, to articulate the values or the principles by which you're trying to do the reform, and then listen to the fear or the concern about the disciplinary difference that needs to be built in, but really put it to the test. So one of the things that folks have found in a number of social science studies, which is why we use rubrics in part, is that when somebody is asked to justify their decision, or why I thought this person got high in terms of their criteria on a rubric, they're less likely to bring bias to that, because they really had to look at evidence and justify it to their colleagues. It's one of the reasons that using criteria is so important. So to have somebody say, okay, so the reason you think that it's important that you don't want to tell people what the vote was in your department, at the department level or the college level, but you think it's okay if it happens around the campus. Like, could you explain that to us a little bit more, like why that needs to be different? And as soon as you have to explain that, it becomes, well, maybe that's not an item that needs to be different. Maybe, that actually should be standardized. Whereas a department really feeling strongly that they be able to send out a teaching portfolio because of how they value teaching and it's the norm in their field, that kind of could be brought into the conversation. I wanted to share that as I've been looking at resources thinking about this, I've been very influenced by UPenn assistant professor, formerly a postdoc and great colleague of mine, Dr. Devani White-Lewis's work that talked about incremental, pragmatist, and progressive approaches to change, and I recommend that work to you. Keegan and Leahy's work on competing commitments, David and Caleb's work on why diversity initiatives fail. They really dig down on accountability measures, which is in some way about restructuring discretion. And of course, Professor Estella Ben-Simon, USC's work on equity-minded approaches that center race in conversations. Yes, and that was actually where I was going to end anyway. So thank you very much. And now I think we want to open it up for questions. So we'll start with you. Thank you.
Hold 1 minute.
Yeah, I just had a question about the last thing you're talking about, what digging down on the accountability.
Yes.
Did you mean they found those to be problematic or really helpful? I didn't quite understand what you meant there.
Absolutely. So I find this work fascinating. I think, so they've studied issues of diversity initiatives in corporations or nonprofit, in government, as well as in higher education. And Frank Dobbin is at Harvard, and I recommend that work. It's really interesting. It's been published in a number of places. What? Oh.
Diversity matters because they were high-quality sociologists. Frank Dobbin and Alexander Collette, 2022. Why diversity matters?
And my, absolutely, thank you for that. And my read of the accountability issue is that one of the things that they were saying is things where you, for example, put the outcome into the PRD of the leader, things where you really hold individuals accountable for outcomes, those and some particular mentoring programs that were engaged where you incentivized sponsorship and support of individuals were more successful than some of the implicit bias workshops that they had seen happening. And for the first part of that, the PRD structure, the actual ability to say turn back a search, that's an example of an accountability device, or to put it in somebody's PRD and hold them accountable that they're not increasing diversity in their field, in their computer science department, were things that they were suggesting be held up and looked at more in higher education, as well as other organizations. That's my read of it, but yeah.
So I also want to invite our virtual participants to type in chat if there are any questions, and also make sure I'm visible here so that if someone has a question, we can speak in the mic. Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for a very, very informative presentation. So before I became an equity advisor, I was so on this concept of discretion because I thought it creates, space for different ideas, innovations, some creativity. But since I've been an equity advisor, I am becoming more and more against discretionary spaces, because I believe that pretty much opens the gate for unfairness and lack of equity. But I don't know how we can address this issue, because discretion means discretion. So,
but discretion can also be used in incredibly agentic ways, right? So it can be used. Certainly a lot of the leadership we've seen around the country where deans or provosts have increased the diversity in their faculty, they often used discretionary resources to place toward hiring of minoritized faculty, or turned back searches. There's one dean I can think of who tells the story of, just starting a process of turning down searches that had no women on them, and did that about 3 or 4 times, and to the point where the folks who were bringing them up realized that they're never going to get a search approved, and just started then regulating themselves in terms of making sure they had diversity in the final pool that was brought to the dean. So yeah.
Since you use that example, because equity advisors at UCI have this is one thing we can do to monitor the search committees. So do you think that's discretion? Because if I'm a dean and I can turn down the search, or I can't change that, then that's almost like, I don't know. Do you think that's a discretion?
Well, I think that when we work with faculty to come together around diversity goals, we leverage their sense of their field, right? Like you would need faculty themselves are going to know their field and the programs that folks come out of and into. They will know the listservs and the various ways that they could be doing outreach. That's leveraging them, right? When they come to the point of developing their rubric or their criteria, what they're looking for, as they integrate DEI in there, we're checking some of that discretion to make sure, or guardrail, that what we intended when we developed is actually carrying through into how we're making decisions. And I think when an equity administrator or a hiring official of some point looks at what they did along the way and said, you said you were going to do these things, but actually I see you didn't, because there's, the outcomes are not aligned with, where the processes weren't followed. And they say, so therefore we're going to not move forward with this search. I think we're restructuring discretion, or we're certainly changing it in some way. Because we're not saying that search committee cannot follow, right, the path and then have a new colleague brought in. We're saying that, no, you got to stay on this path because we agreed this is part of our values. So I've certainly myself, I was an equity advisor when I was in the College of Education. I'm still in the College of Education. When I was an associate dean at Maryland, and certainly saw situations where what was written down was good, but then as it moved along, it was clear that it wasn't really factoring into decisions that were being made. And so then there's a really tough decision to be made about, what happens in the politics there of turning it back and saying no. There's some bravery in that, right, of what has to happen, because there'll be a lot of backlash for those conversations.
I'm going to turn also to my colleagues who are monitoring chat, and you'll keep me aware if there's a question that comes up.
Thank you so much. I would have tons of questions, but one area in which I found resistance was when I was chair and running some searches, I made sure that we adopted rubrics to make the search, but then the final decision could not simply be made on that. Faculty really didn't want to go all the way down. And also when it came to the presidential postdoctoral fellowship program, which is one of these great opportunities that we have here in the UC system, there are time constraints that make it very complicated to run a national search so that everyone is on board before we receive manifestations of interest to work with some of our faculty. We found a kind of way of getting faculty involved, which is really more nominal than real, but it poses, there's definitely the problem that you mentioned, that these targeting opportunities hires create the sense that faculty in particular loses the real important discretionary power that they have, which is to raise their hands or not to raise their hands for a hire. And that creates a lot of difficulty. So whatever you can
Yeah, no, I
suggest
totally
around
agree with you. At least understanding the competing commitment, though. I get to work with some wonderful leaders at Maryland, and one of the things that I remember talking to one of them about was how in even supervising folks or interacting with them, about how he felt like if he could just figure out what that person's motivation was, for doing a good job or for whatever the project was, that it was just always easier to kind of move forward. And I find that trying to understand or diagnose what the manner of resistance is in the particular space, in that case is I'm going to lose a line. You find the same thing with dual career hires, right? So let's take that as an example. Folks will be like, well, of course we'd want to accommodate, and maybe the provost's office will pay 1/3 of that position for a period of time. And this person seems perfectly nice, but next year, when we go to put up the assistant professor we thought we were going to have, now suddenly we won't get that, and this wasn't the area we thought that we were gonna. That's a real thing. That's a real competing commitment. So competing commitments don't have to be judged as all bad, right? They are also tangibly real sometimes. And so I have seen provost offices figure out some accommodation for that so that if they do want to hire the dual career person, it doesn't take away a line, or there's some additive way in which they work it out that it is not subtracting in the way that the resistance is to it. There's a lot of ways in which that's handled, but I think at least thinking about what is your main sticking point here, like what is the, what are we concerned about losing in asking folks to do this or that? The thing is, it's an interaction with the context that's very specific, which is why we need some discretion or people who are knowledgeable about that context. Initially there's been resistance about some things we added to syllabi, right? And some of that was about folks feeling comfortable about what they would be doing in that space without any training or knowledge. So there, it's like, I don't want to look bad. I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to. And so if that's the thing, it's a different way to pursue getting them that thing than it is if it's a line, right? Or they're different kinds of resources. So I personally find it helpful to try to figure out what that resistance is about at its core and see if there are any options to relieve or in a parallel way make both things happen.
So I know we're going on to another section, but before doing so, I noticed there's some conversation in the chat, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, so if you don't want to say further, that's fine. But I know Sharon Block mentioned about Mary Blair Loy's work with
Yes.
rubrics and this whole concept that comments upon discretion is at this point. I don't know, Sharon, do you want to unmute and say anything further?
I didn't really have anything further to say other than linking, sorry about that, other than linking Mary's work in the chat. And someone also added that she'll be doing a talk in San Diego if people want to go to that.
Can I just
I don't know
add?
if you wanted to comment.
I would just love to say I love Mary Blair Loy's work. She's on my advisory board for my DEI study. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. It's really also a very helpful. It would be great to share it with search committees before they begin creating a rubric. Because it's not just about how you create your criteria, but it's how you normalize people to what the different items are and how you're going to look for evidence for each of them and how you use it reflexively. So it's great. Thank you for that.
So I think that might move us to the next section.
Oh.
Great. Any other?
There's one
Oh,
question.
wait, Nina.
Thank you so much, and inspired by Sharon's suggestion of sociology and colleagues' work, Kalev and Dobbin, that you mentioned, Carrie and O'Mara. And acknowledging that I'm a sociologist, just want to put out there, I think, this lingering feeling how discretion happens within structure and institutional space. So people who have power and who are on board with the values of DEI can make all of these changes with their discretion. But oftentimes we are not there, right? We have people who have who have less power, try to argue for the importance of inclusive excellence, and we have professed commitment, but not real institutional change that would support that. So yes, the dean has discretion, but that comes through an actual policy that comes out, right? One could say, or resources that are being allocated. At UCI, we have the Inclusive Excellence Hiring Initiative. That's been key to diversifying our faculty because it's an actual line, right? An FTE line that can be awarded, and it's a program, so it's kind of an institutional practice. So I just wanted to mention how important it is to put together the agency of individuals within the structures in which this happens. And I think that, your talk about restructuring discretion really points to how oftentimes it is these structures that will make a difference, and that we have sufficient and necessary causes here. And I don't know if you have some comments related to that, but I thought it was important to highlight.
The interplay between structure and agency is fascinating, and I'm glad that you raised that. If you think about the Harvey Mudd example that Sapna Cherian and Hazel that Marcus did in their article about default systems, they talked about a computer science series of courses wherein students that were coming in had not had the same socialization in terms of like summer camps with coding, et cetera. And so male students were had this built-in structural advantage in those classrooms. The dean, the faculty, using their knowledge of these classrooms, their agency, but also their power, as you pointed out, we're able to say, why do we have to have those two courses in that order? We're losing half the women who are experiencing this discrimination in classrooms. And so they then both changed the order and the way in which those classes worked, But they also leveraged faculty on aspects of bullying, I believe, in classrooms, like hostile kinds of and inclusive classroom techniques. So it was a combination of, and there were resources to do that, right? Going to your point about the fact that these things happen within a complicated structure of resources, of power, of socioeconomic, realities. So I like that example to your point, because I do think a lot of the restructuring discretion requires this interplay of agency and resources, and that's a lot of what Dobbin and Caleb is talking about. All right, so I think what we might do now is at your table, ask you to think about that area that you identified earlier, and this would be online. You'll be put into, and I think briefly, probably for about 10 minutes, into a small group where I'd like you to think about, in an area that you're working, admissions, in salary, whatever that is, are you trying to leverage, check, or restructure discretion? And what kind of resistances do you find? And strategies that are most effective in response. So we're going to give you about 10 minutes to do that and ask you to do that now. Thank you. I wonder if we can start with the room and see if there were any folks who had a good conversation at their table that wanted to share a thread from that conversation with us, with the room, and we have a microphone if anybody would like to do that.
Or virtually in chat.
Or virtually in chat. And I will say that at our table, there was a great conversation about diffusing how issues of discretion are also about getting more people discretion, diffusing people's access to discretion. And that was really helpful for me. That was really a great conversation. So you might also say it's also about getting more people, getting the discretion that people have to be more transparent, that now I can see what you're doing. I'm asking you to see your work, which is what the criteria, when I ask you if you can tell me why you voted this way, or why this person isn't, let's say in a job situation or a graduate application, somebody that you would vote for, can you tell me why they didn't meet your expectations for teaching experience, et cetera. And then by doing that, by asking for that, some folks could say, well, am I taking that person's discretion away to just vote however they want without rationalizing their opinion, kind of a thing? A little bit. We are collegially asking that we hold each other accountable for sharing how we're using our discretion in the service of the outcome we've agreed is important.
Well, we will be continuing conversations. I want to thank Carrie-Ann O'Meara again for just joining us.
Thank you.
And just to close us out a bit, thank you all for coming, both in person and virtually. We're going to look forward to having another conversation February 2nd. I was really pleased that Carrie-Ann referenced Lisa Leahy, who will be joining us actually in person. And it's a longer workshop, so please be committed to come, because I think she's going to make it rather engaging as well as virtually. So, and then we're going to have 2 other virtual workshops that we'll share with you down the road. So thank you again. I'm going to close this out today and just say that we'll be posting a lot of the information on the web page for you, and anything that comes to mind in terms of topics and so forth, please feel free to share. Thank you.